So yes, today we will be talking about um, kind of dignity and resilience in the era of COVID, and we'll be joined by our three panelists here, Dr. Patricia Martuscelli, who is currently working at the Resilient Futures for the Rohingya Refugees, and also the Rohingya Journeys of Violence and Resilience in Bangladesh and its Neighbours projects. She has an MA in International Relations and a PhD in Political Science, and her research interests involve asylum and migration politics in Latin America, family reunification of refugees, and refugees and COVID-19 in Brazil. Next, we have Moshood Olanrewaju, who is an emerging community psychologist. His studies focus on refugee strategies of survival post-settlement, with scopes on enacting alternatives and resettlement systems. Moshood's abilities to articulate and apply collective empowerment perspective to support marginalised communities in their effort to gain access to resources and participate in community development is grounded in his embrace of the accompaniment model, which we've talked about before in previous webinars. And he's currently consulting for the American Red Cross as part of his PhD fieldwork. And finally, Ghania Chaudhry is co-founder of Finding Refuge and a graduate student at NYU. She has also been a site leader for Service Through Faith, where she led multiple service trips to Athens. It was through this work that Finding Refuge first began. She is currently a strategic partnership intern at the NYC Mayor's Office for International Affairs, where she worked on a project to help connect the Sustainable Development Goals to the urban context. So thank you all so much for joining us. We'll start with our first question, which is, can you briefly summarize the extraordinary challenges that you have seen refugee populations face due to the pandemic, specifically as it pertains to your own research and work that you have been doing? Moshood, can we start with you, please?
Yeah, thank you for having me. Patricia, it's good to see you again. I've not met with Ghana, but it's nice to be acquainted here in this space. I was fortunate to coordinate a study for the Global Alliance for Behavioral Health and Social Justice, when COVID started. And what we were doing was to get how COVID was affecting refugees. Both we're well focused on the international community that is outside of America, because we were based in America. So the study took place. We got data from Jordan, from Lebanon, Turkey, from Nigeria, Congo. I think what we see, it's not so much unusual from what we've known before, so to say, right? Outside of US, there was a lot of interruption on services, both in terms of people that come to help refugees in the camps, right? And then in terms of even refugees themselves being able to go out and receive services, there was a lot of disruption in that area. One of the other things that we observed from the report, I think, is there was a lot of panic because communication was lost between refugees in what we now call Global South, I think, and then their family here. There was a lot of miscommunication. So there was a lot of people were panicking. It was in a wash. That makes it become worse because you don't know what's the state of your family at that time. That was big on the report. Loss of international volunteer support, right? That went down like almost 60 to 70%. And the health infrastructure was nothing. I mean, even before COVID, was nothing to write home about. But it became worse. Those were some of the biggest challenges that we observed with the report. But in the US here, because of my relationship with most of the organization, a lot of them shut their door, but they were still providing services virtually. But this is not anything, because most refugees don't have transportation to go get whatever they need to get. Most don't even have radios to communicate. I mean, to get the information, so to say, So all these were creating a whole bunch of, even more than the COVID itself presents, challenges, right? Refugee lives in the community that are already marginalized. So it means a lot of the community that they resettle in, they have things to deal with. So once they go into this community, and when COVID started, it creates more unbearable condition for them. And in some refugee households, we see many generations living together. And so if one person get it in one household, guaranteed there's possibly like 7 people, 8 people getting it, because they can't move around. So those were some of the challenges we noticed back and forth, both here in the US and some of the ones we record abroad.
Thank you. That's really interesting. And I think that's a really good point, that fundamentally everything we talk about today is going to be an exacerbation of an existing problem. As you say, the services weren't great before. There was already a lot of gaps in provision. And what we're really discussing today is just how things have been more difficult in some ways. Patricia, could you elaborate on that, please?
Well, thank you. Nice to see you again, Moshood. Thank you from Inside Collaborative for the invitation. Nice to meet you, Ghania. So my research is more based in the situation of refugees living in Brazil, which is a more urban places. So refugees living basically in cities, most of them in big cities like São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. And last year we conducted interviews with 29 refugees living in the states of Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo in the outbreak of the pandemic in Brazil. So the first 2 weeks when these states, they were adopting the measures of closure of non-essential business, schools, stay at home, and all these measures recommended by the World Health Organization. So from their narratives, we could address 3 different types of challenges. So the first type of challenges would be the same challenges faced as Brazilians that are connected to the economic and labor situation of the refugees themselves. So if the refugees, they are employed or not, if they have access to social protection connected to work, or if they are freelancers or they have small business who had to close. And their economic situation before COVID. If they have an emergency money or income. So in that sense, they are facing the same challenges as Brazilians in the same situation. So the closure of schools and children having to eat at home, which put a lot of pressures in families with vulnerable economic situation. And many Brazilians and refugees that were not sure if they would be able to pay for their rent, since housing is a major issue as well in those urban areas in Brazil. But at the same time, the refugees, since they are refugees, non-nationals, who had this experience of forced migration, they faced additional challenges that Brazilians do not face. The second type of challenges are challenges that were aggravated by the pandemic, so challenges that they used to face before, as mentioned by Moshood. But the pandemic brought, so for example, access to information was a major challenge that put refugees at risk of following in schemes to steal their personal data, and fake news about the pandemic. There was not a lot of information in different languages. The civil society organizations, they were providing that explanation on how to access, for example, to the emergency financial benefit, and a lot of uncertainty if refugees could accept that because the system was entirely in Portuguese and using documentation that was the Brazilians had and not documentation of immigrants or refugees. So that was a challenge. A second challenge was the lack of social networks. So refugees, they felt more disconnected than Brazilians. They could not ask for help if they needed to stay at a home of a friend, of a parent or uncle, because they had no family in Brazil. And a third challenge that was aggravated was the fear of discrimination and especially in the access of healthcare. So Brazil has a public healthcare system and all migrants and refugees can access that, but many refugees, they were afraid of, especially if the system was in a situation where the doctors had to choose to whom they would provide treatment or oxygen. And they were really afraid that the doctors would choose Brazilians over non-Brazilians. So they were really afraid. And finally, we had a different type of challenges that were created by the pandemic. So the closure of borders, a lot of especially Venezuelans that cannot enter in Brazil and apply for asylum, refugees who were in the middle of the family reunification for the families abroad. So they were not sure if their family members would receive a visa when, if the family member already with a visa could enter in Brazil. So there was a lot of uncertainty. Essential services for refugees were closed. So companies that used to send money abroad, they were closed, and also companies that used to do international phone calls. There was the closure of migration services, so naturalization process, asylum process were delayed. There was a lot of uncertainty about that. The organizations that provided service to refugees, they were closed, although they were trying to provide services online, but there was a loss of reference for the refugees. And finally, most of the refugees, they were leaving the pandemic twice. So leaving the pandemic in Brazil, and Brazil, as you may know, is not doing a great job now, but also they were worried with their families abroad, since their families, they were in countries at war or humanitarian crisis, or countries that had less resources than Brazil to fight the pandemic. So not so good hospital facilities or a number of enough equipment to support them. So those are the three types of challenges that we identified in Brazil.
Thank you. That's really interesting. And it's certainly something I haven't heard a great deal about. I'm based in the UK, and although we have heard some things about the Brazilian handling of the pandemic, we haven't heard a great deal about the Brazilian refugee experience of the pandemic. So thank you. That's really good to know. Ghania, what's your perspective?
Hi, thank you for having me, and thank you. It was really nice to meet you, Patricia, Moshood. I'm really looking forward to hear your perspectives. I feel a little humbled because I'm not as experienced as both of you, but I do have a lot of hands-on experience in Greece. So I'm just going to talk about a little bit about my organization and then explain how that ties into the refugee experience. So Finding Refuge basically provides homes and shelter to homeless refugees in Athens, and that really ties into what refugees were experiencing during COVID, because unfortunately the Greek government had evicted a lot of refugees from their housing schemes. And it was a very interesting time because it was in the middle of all this situation happening with COVID. And then you have all these people who are being evicted from their apartments when everyone was stay at home. So the hypocrisy of the system really was kind of shown. But I'm gonna take a time perspective because I was actually in Greece in March when they started the stay-at-home orders, and kind of take you guys through that perspective. So it was interesting to see how right then and there in March, when they had the stay-at-home order, it affected refugees on the individual level because it completely changed their lifestyles. And that in that sense, it's very refugee communities are very communal. They enjoy going to people's houses, and suddenly you're disconnected from everyone. They imposed lockdowns and a mandated curfew. The parks that people used to come together and enjoy time together were closed. It was completely barren and empty. And then also on that end, there's a lot of undocumented people there's a lot of people who've gotten second rejections who technically shouldn't be in Greece. And so then what happened was the policing apparatus kind of took advantage of that and took advantage of kind of calling abusing kind of refugee men and women and fining people. And so they were charged with these massive fines that they weren't able to pay. And you see racial disparities as well, because if there was a Greek person or person that looks kind of Greek, they weren't penalized as much as refugee looking people who look like refugees. So you have those racial disparities in March. And I remember seeing the police take over Exarchia Square and fine all these people. So that was happening in March. And then in June, when they had the massive evictions, you had all these people kind of pushed out and like thrown onto the streets. And on top of that, you know, how Patricia mentioned and Moshood mentioned, like all these organizations that were supposed to help them, you know, were closed because of lockdown. So that affected the services they were able to provide. And so a lot of like individual volunteers would go and do distributions, etc. But the thing is, like, the systemic issue is the fact that they're homeless on the street during a global pandemic, like the, you know. And then also on the islands and the camps, that the hypocrisy of the way that people were living in, because they didn't have basic like items like hand washing areas, was shown, because the importance of washing your hands came up now because of the pandemic. Now people were thinking refugees should have the right to wash hands, but it wasn't even like the government or the UN like pushing to have hand washing statements. It was like refugees within the camp like had a Facebook group, and they were like, hey, like we need hand washing solutions, like you can't just forget about us. So it was also a time for a lot of like grassroots refugee groups to kind of like take space, because NGOs stepped back, you know. In that time you had all these like NGOs, like, you know, who were like, we're doing this and this, stepping back, and they had to, because they had to reshape how their services were going to be provided online. So that in that gap, a lot of grassroots refugee-led activities started, and they gained momentum. So this organization I'm referring to is Moria White Helmets. They're refugees within Moria camp. And they literally were like, hey, like we are in the camp, we know what we need. So, you know, you guys aren't coming into our camp now. So give us some funds, give us the money so we can provide for our own community. And that was kind of like an empowering moment for the refugee community in Greece, and I'm sure in other areas as well, when you have these like NGOs stepping back, you know, the NGO industrial complex stepping back a little bit and taking a pause and giving opportunity for the community themselves to build up. But along that lines, you also have like limited like services. Asylum procedures were delayed a lot, like Patricia was saying, like in Greece, as offices were like closed for months, which affected how people were able to process their papers. And then when it returned, it became a really big mess because they're expediting the process. So that means fast denials. So I think, I don't know where it's heading now. NGOs are starting to pick up services. So that's good, like adjusting to that kind of like dynamic. But yeah, so it's a very like, it's like, there's a lot of pros and cons, but I think the bright side is the fact that there is spaces for refugees to take space and be like, hey, like we know what our community needs.
Absolutely. I think that kind of refugee leadership is essential in answer to pretty much all of the problems that we'll be discussing today. So that's really important. Thank you. I'll move on to the next question now. I'll just remind our audience that they're very welcome to submit any questions for any or all of our panelists if they'd like to. So the next question is, do you feel, well, I'll start by saying that, of course, we all know that there have been huge gaps in services and in state provision for refugees throughout the world. But do you feel that there have been any additional gaps in services or provision revealed by the pandemic? And if yes, then what do you think those are? Patricia, could you start us off on that one, please?
Well, in our research, the refugees themselves, they felt they were left behind during the pandemic. So Brazil is a complicated case because we have a very, actually, the Brazilian government was chosen as the worst government in the world dealing with the pandemic. So in general, Brazilians are also left behind in the responses to the pandemic in some sense, because the government's not doing a good job. We have in the past few days, the highest death rates due to the pandemic, and they are not the exact numbers. So the situation in Brazil is really complicated at the moment and during the entire pandemic. So, but in general, the refugees themselves, they felt they were left behind. So that the government, the federal government, the state government, the local governments, they were not talking about them or their needs or their considerations. But at the same time, there were two movements. The first one from the civil society organizations that already provided service to this community, providing especially information in different languages on how to access, for example, the emergency benefits that the Brazilian government created, which was super important. And also academics. So in Brazil, universities, they have an agreement with UNHCR, and they have a special chair that's called Chair Sérgio Vieira de Mello, where the universities, they provide teaching, research, and services connected to asylum. So many of those chairs all around Brazil, they provided information in different languages about the measures, about how to access healthcare, useful information. Or different organizations and refugee and migrant-led organizations, they also started campaigns, information campaigns online with videos with different languages, but also information to provide especially the material needs, so food baskets, hygiene kits. So you saw these movements from civil society organizations and universities connected to this share, especially providing information, but also some food baskets, for example, and other needs, but also migrant-led organizations and refugee-led organizations providing the information in a language, in formats, in social media, in a way that were useful to refugees, not to be left behind, to know how they can access the benefit, how if they are in need of food, having some type of register, or so we see that in Brazil. We continue to see that but the situation in Brazil is really bad because, you know, the pandemic is just without control at all. So that's the situation at the moment.
Thank you. I think that's something that struck me there is how you said that you have non-state actors publicizing information in different languages about very basic things, and that's something we see here in the UK as well. I know it's a problem in, well, many parts of the world, and that feels like something that really should be, I mean, don't get me wrong, that's brilliant that it's being done, but it really feels like something that should be part of state provision is actually making people within the country aware of basic things like where to go for health concerns and things like that. So yeah, I think it's great that that's happening, and also it really should be coming under state provision. Ghania, what's your perspective on this?
Sorry. So yeah, in terms of the gaps, I mentioned like health, and I think or like sanitation, and I think the pandemic really brought to light the inadequacies within the, you know, the most basic thing about living in a dignified life is having sanitary like spaces to live. And unfortunately, like despite the pandemic, like you have Moria 2 camp, and people are literally living in dirty like mutts, and like, you know, and so it's kind of like, yes, like you have this like global push to have more sanitary places to live, more like, you know, like a dignified place to live, homes, etc. But then it only applies to people that are not refugees. And I think like that really shows like the continuous gap in terms of like services, that even like the government or nonprofits haven't even like addressed. And I think like there's also like the complicity of like big NGOs, international NGOs like the UN, in allowing for the creation of another facility like that without profit like you know, proper like facilities to support people in a global pandemic. And I think another thing is just like you know, the governments are really focused on like supporting their own people, and that's where kind of like the paradox within like the refugee regime comes, where like governments are kind of like not forced to, but they're supposed to take on refugees as their own citizens, but essentially they don't see them as their own citizens. So in terms of like access to services that their citizens are given, like vaccines, now this is a very big issue currently, because like a lot of refugees aren't given vaccines, or not going to get vaccines despite, you know, like being vulnerable communities. So I'm very interested to see how the inequities that were played out before kind of like COVID-19 started, the gaps are going to like persist or even get exacerbated as we transition to the next phase of like providing vaccines to refugees.
Yeah, I think certainly the vaccine gap is deeply worrying. I'm interested in what you had to say about accommodation as well. That's something that we saw here in the UK as well, that on the one hand, the government immediately tried to find temporary accommodation for basically the UK's entire homeless population, and was fairly successful in that, which was quite remarkable and really showed how much the lack of dealing with homelessness is a lack of political will rather than a lack of true solutions. But at the same time, they were throwing people out of immigration detention centres onto the streets because those immigration detention centres were obviously hotspots for infection. So it was really, there was a real gap in how they were treating both the homeless population and the people they had detained in IRCs as well. Moshood, what's your perspective on this?
You know, in this case, I probably will speak the same as the two as Gaia and Patricia, because you know these things follow each other. I listed you know, lack of trained refugee, you know, lack of trained refugee advocate, because where these camps were not, the people could not travel there, the volunteers, the professional service volunteer could not travel there. So the camps were left, the refugees were left in a very, very vulnerable state, particularly on the continent of Africa. Like, you know, people have to travel. And when we have these people doing this work, refugees are not trained to take over or to do this work themselves. I'm very big on that. Refugee voice amplification, or however we can push them to be taking care of these things themselves. So we wouldn't need COVID or such pandemic to be what would teach us, like they need to take ownership of their own affair. You know, this was blown open in this situation because when they couldn't come, the vulnerability became extra. We also noticed something, the travel route, the displaced people are walking, you know, to and from, became more dangerous because the foreigners were not around, so there's nobody to check. I mean, it's not like they were doing a good job even when they were there, but those routes became more extra dangerous. So people were disconnected. People that were in this space could not go to the point A, they could not go to point B because of this route. They became more dangerous. You know, overcrowded facilities, you know, reception center, all this shut down. And so these guys were left to fend for themselves with the little that is not even available, right? But one thing that I started watching, that I started learning big about, because I didn't know before, is, you know, there's about 145 countries, right, that are signatory to the United Nations Refugee Convention of, I think, 1951. Funny enough, almost all the countries in the South and Southeast Asia, none of them is signatory to this convention. So it means that anyone that is a refugee in Asia is actually in double jeopardy with COVID because there's no refugee camp. They're living amongst the populace. And guess what? Even the populace are not as friendly as they should be in this case, because everybody's trying to fend for themselves, you know. So it became, the maltreatment was so obvious. All of the reports we got from that part of the world, from Malaysia precisely, especially to the Rohingya community in Malaysia, it was not something we want to write about at all. Those gaps, and it's because we're not sort of training refugees to take ownership. You know, it's almost like we're always babying this group, you know, and that is the biggest gap that I see. Something that I think we should deal with now. From today, we should start dealing with it. Like, it's not like these guys are not, and I keep saying these guys, you know, but I'm sure you guys know what I mean. It's not like they're not, they don't know what to do to take ownership. When refugees arrive here in the West, between going back and forth between the organizations, you know, there's something that I've not seen it anywhere else, but I don't want to lay claim to it. I use it in my study. I call it post-settlement regression. You know, so I've not seen it anywhere, but I'm sure somebody will have done something about it. It's just too easy for somebody to have not studied that. So when the refugee gets here, with all the trauma they face coming into this community, into this United States, some of them become stronger because they have to travel to 4 or 5 different countries, and they take on different lessons. And so they are strong coming into this country. But because of the design of the organization here, they regress back because they have to face this system and face this thing. We saw that also as a gap during this time, because some of them could not deal with themselves anymore. They have to go and rely on the organization. And the organization, all of them moved to virtual. So they could not even help as much as they need to help. That's some of what I see as what we need to deal with, like right about now.
Thank you, Moshood. That's really interesting. I'm really struck by what you said about Southeast Asia not being signatories, because that suggests that there's not merely a gap in provision, but even in recognition or validation of status and identity there, which I think can be really important. And I'd be really interested to hear more about that. We've had some new arrivals, so I'd just like to say to them that they're very welcome to submit questions either in the Q&A or the chat box for any or all of our panelists. In the meantime, I'll move on to the next question. We've talked about some of the difficulties and problems faced by migrants during the pandemic. And now I'd like to turn to a slightly more positive subject, which is what can actually be done about this? What actions and initiatives either have worked or can work well, in your opinion, to kind of support the dignity and resilience of refugees in this really challenging time and global climate? Ghania, could you start us off, please?
Yes, of course. This is a very hard question to answer, but I think the most important way like we can support as not being part of the community refugees in terms of their resilience is empowering them, giving the spaces and the avenues for them to participate in like providing services for themselves or for their communities, and not taking up space in their struggles and in their in terms of them presenting their situation. I think it's really important to kind of the accompaniment model in terms of helping them get to a point, but then also letting them go and provide this. And I think the most prominent example I think is the success of the Moria white helmets, that a group of refugees within the camp themselves literally are providing sanitary items. They did a whole recycling initiative, so when people will get food in exchange for bringing plastic bottles or to throw away. So these innovative solutions is something so incredible that I feel the con side of all this, I feel the nonprofit industrial complex really benefited a lot from these COVID appeals. It became a very rallying cry. COVID-19 came, we have to provide these services, but also are these funds going back to so in the contrast, you have these organizations that are more grassroots. So supporting grassroots organizations that integrate more of the community themselves rather than big NGOs that perpetuate the same inequities that we've been seeing. And then I think on top of that is also pressuring the government's a little bit to be more accountable. I think what even what the Black Lives Matter movement taught us in the US is that collective action can make a difference. I mean, it's slow, but it does put pressure on the right actors. So I think the best way otherwise we can address these inequities is being hey, we're seeing that these people are human beings, and why is there a double standard in terms of the items of their dignity, you know what I mean, supporting them and being an ally in that way. So putting more pressure on the EU governments or in Southeast Asia to recognize refugees and provide them what they need, but also giving activists that are refugees the space to speak and voice their truth.
Absolutely, I think that's really important, that that activism and that pressure on states to do better is hugely important, and that's something that we're actually looking at the moment, is having a webinar around the criminalization of activist work and NGO work in some places. So watch this space for that. Moshood, what's your perspective on this?
I think I said it before too. As a product, let's put it that way, I think all of our work should be centered around pushing refugees to lead this fight. We should be we're just the architect building that space for them. I think our work should be central around that. Regardless of what I said about Malaysia and almost all the places in Asia that we were observing, it is same people, the same refugee, displaced people, they were the one taking charge. They were the one going to the elderly. They were the one going to their neighbors to get this and get that. It's not the citizen of those countries. They were looking out for themselves. But if we go back to the space of, oh, well, and everything went back to normal and all this organization went back to the services and they start doing what they're doing, their representative is back on the base. And so refugee becomes secondary. They are the one doing the work instead of refugee. We're not doing it seems to me we're not doing the right thing. When Ghana said NGO industrial complex stepping back, I was almost laughing here. And it's not because I'm laughing at the way she said it. It's just people say it, but I've not seen that they are stepping out or stepping back in any way. It's very complex. It's built into the colonial system as it is. So I don't know where it's stepping back to. I'm praying that it step back, because we need that to step back for the people that actually need, because they're doing the work. They just need us to be the voice or be the advocate that we are. But let them do it. That's why I say them as the product, as the final product, they will do a more better job. We just need to give them those spaces, those situations, however we can do it. Because of Patricia, the last time we were on a webinar together, I started paying more attention to the refugee situation in Brazil. I didn't think I need to, but because of that, I started paying attention to it. And I know that at the end of the day, we're speaking the same language in that regard. The fight we're fighting seems like it's the same, even though what I'm researching is refugee strategy of survival, and I hear what she's doing, you will see that if you check it very, it's the same thing. But we need refugee, with whatever we are doing, we need them to be the one actually doing the work on the front line, which we've not been able to, we've not been successful with that, I think, And I don't think it's, because I'm also a researcher, I think a lot of it has to do with the embodiment that everything is, the history of everything in the colonial system, Oh, we have to go through the school system, we have to do research. Some of what I do is speaking to this that I'm talking about. Either I want it or not, my research has a place. It has what it's doing in this community, right? But then the thing is, I have to do the research. But how can I help people on the ground? People like Ghana. I'm sorry, how do I pronounce it so I don't keep messing it up?
No worries, it's Ghania.
Ghania. So people like Ghana that have these outfits that are doing one-on-one work with refugees, however we can parley with them, because it seems like that's very, very important. When I'm done, I think what I want to do is I actually want to teach, but I'm thinking I want to jump on the plane and just keep going to refugee camp. I want to do a one-on-one accompaniment with refugee, but I have to think like I need to write something. I need to make some kind of money. But if I don't do that, this one-on-one accompaniment, it's worked for me so much in this community that I am. I don't work with the organization, but I accompany refugees. I put them one by one out of this community, talk to them, what can we do? That's how the work is being done. I do a lot of grassroots work. That's the strength that's in those work for me. So that's the way I see it now.
Thank you, Moshood. It sounds like there's a lot of overlap there in yours and Ghania's perspectives in terms of the importance of refugee-led initiatives, which I'm in complete agreement with. I think that's hugely important. Patricia, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yes, I completely agree with Ghania and Moshood. I would just like to say some things more connected to the pandemic. So I think one of the important things that we saw is the importance of access to equitable, and good healthcare, and then the importance of integrating refugees, migrants. It doesn't matter their migration status, in healthcare systems, and funding national public healthcare systems so people would have an equitable access. And then also right now the access to the vaccines. We cannot leave behind millions of people because they are non-nationals. They also need to have access to vaccines if we want to I don't know, to fight COVID. So this is one important thing I would say. The second thing is guaranteeing information access, especially at the moments like health emergency, pandemics, when information can really save lives. And I don't think we have this equitable access to information for refugees and migrants due many of gaps we discussed it here. Finally, it's really important that governments don't use the pandemic or future risks of other pandemics to close even more their borders and separate families and deny people access to asylum, to protection, to movement. So I think those, let's say, three things to add to what Ghania and Moshood already said, they would be really important from now on.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there is a real worry around the already worsening trend of kind of nationalism at borders and closing of borders. And I think there's a real worry that that will get even worse with the pandemic being used as an excuse there, even post-pandemic potentially. I'm interested in what you said about access to healthcare and information. We'll be talking more about healthcare in a couple of weeks. Actually, we've got another webinar with healthcare professionals about kind of access to healthcare for migrants in the pandemic. But I wonder.
May I say something that I forgot?
Please do.
There was the fourth thing. The other thing that I would like to ask is that in our research, we saw how refugees could contribute more. So we also need to think more about revalidation of diplomas and actually granting access to refugees to the labor market using their own skills. So for example, during our interviews, we interviewed doctors who were working as cleaners because their doctor diplomas, they were not recognized in Brazil. The process was just massive bureaucracy, massive money and time. So we really need to better involve these refugees. They could be supporting our healthcare systems. They could be supporting themselves and their host countries much more if they had access to more people-friendly, refugee-friendly, migrant-friendly revalidation schemes and those type of programs. So this would be the fourth thing. Sorry, I forgot about.
No, you're absolutely right. It's so frustrating seeing how many countries don't allow asylum seekers to work until they get official papers. I've seen this in many different places throughout the world, and it always has so many impacts that people maybe don't associate with it. So you're absolutely right, of course, that not allowing medical staff from other countries to work during the pandemic has a huge impact on our kind of national health services, but it also has a huge impact on the self-esteem and the mental health of all workers, not just mental health. Not just health workers, and of course it also has a huge impact on their economic situation as well, as you'd expect. So it's so important, and it's really frustrating how many countries just don't allow it at all. Our last question is, I think maybe a good follow-up to this idea that we heard earlier about the importance of projects being refugee-led, which is, what can those of us who aren't directly involved in the sector do to support this, to support these actions and these initiatives? And I think that's a really important question in relation to the idea of refugee-led initiatives, because, as you say, it's important for the NGO industrial complex to take a step back, but equally we still want to keep people engaged. We still want to keep people who aren't directly involved in this work engaged and supporting the cause. So what can they do in this kind of situation? Moshood, could you start us off, please?
Yeah, there's like you said, it's not like we want anyone to go out of business, but the support is I will take the support from the grassroots if we can, they're closer to the grassroots organizations that are doing this work. But then these grassroots organizations they're not financially stable. So whatever they can do is actually limited. But the refugee community is actually closer to them. So I guess we should be supporting them more. Whoever has the money, whoever has the, the knowledge to use, should be supporting this grassroots organization more, because refugees are closer to them more. Some of them even speak their language. Some of them are from the same cultural background. So who should we be supporting? I don't want United Nations to go out of business, but will I support United Nations compared to these people that are doing the work on the ground? I know Madi, right? I will give Madi money before I can think of United Nations, because I know she's on the ground. I'll give Ghana money now that I know her, because they're on the ground. We need to support them more. They do the grassroots work. They meet on a daily basis with refugees. And we also need to be, again, I don't want this big organization to go out of business. We also need to be, they're too big. There's a lot of priorities. I'm actually speaking against United Nations now. I know it's put me a lot of space, a lot of trouble, because I'm saying United Nations is one doing conflict resolution. They're also the one managing conflict. It seems to me like there's a lot there that, people like you and I that are doing the grassroots work needs to start thinking about. They have all the money. We don't have the money, but we know we have a direct relationship with these people. So if you ask me, I guess what I'm saying is we need to support more of the grassroots power, whatever you want to call that, and see how we can build on that. Because in that grassroots power is where you see refugees stand up, and do the things that they need to do on their own. I mean, there's a lot of points, but I'll let other people take it from there.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that it's important to all of us to kind of maintain those contacts and maintain an awareness of who is actually working in an ethical way and in a kind of way that actually makes space for refugees to lead the work, and then to do everything we can to support them. Patricia, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, this first point is super important, as Moshood mentioned, supporting refugee-led, migrant-led organizations, the grassroots organizations. I would add that the importance of activism, as Ghania mentioned before. So, and the importance of continue these activists to pressure, so refugees, migrants, they would not be left behind during COVID responses. They would have access to healthcare. They would have access to vaccines. So this is a really important movement. And together with that, especially people that are, academics, experts, people that work more with these communities, they also have a responsibility to share the knowledge in a way that is useful to the general public, and to deconstruct the myths, the fake news about migrants and refugees, that they bring disease, or they steal jobs, or they are terrorists, So we really need to, and today with this fake news, very xenophobic, criminalizing, discriminatory discourses from politicians, we need this sensitization, this activism, this deconstruction of myths even more. We need to do this. We need to engage people. We need to train and to sensitize people, because sometimes refugees, they are invisible. So if we explain them in a way that is friendly, that's considering. So this could also help, because refugees, they will have to have contact with healthcare providers. So we really need those healthcares to understand what is asylum, their challenges, their specificities. They need to have contact with state bureaucrats to do their documents. They need to have contact with educational systems. So we need to train and sensitivize and do this process of information for teachers, directors, social workers, lawyers, and people that are in the system. Sometimes they don't know. So that's why the activism and this information, continuing information process, they are important. And people that are not experts, they can share good information. They can try to stop sharing fake news. They can try to to also support those organizations in these grassroots organizations and refugee-led organizations in this sharing of information, their voices, their work, what they are doing as well.
Absolutely, yeah. I think kind of amplifying the voices and the information that people need is really important. That's something we can all contribute to. And finally, Ghania, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I think both Moshood and Patricia had really good points, and they're very complimentary. I would just like to add is one thing is being very critical, like Moshood was saying about like these larger and international NGOs, and like I don't know, I do a lot of research on like refugees for school and work, and so I get all these YouTube ads about them being in these camps and stuff like that. So I think it's also like being critical in your mind, but also being critical to your peers about, hey, like if you're seeing this isn't really okay, and explain like the colonial like aspects of it and the problematic nature of ads like this, because I think it's a whole like paradigm shift within your own mind that we have to like get people normalized to, where like people donate money to these organizations because they see people in these like very like precarious situations, and like the whole point is to like pull on people's like strings and emotions, but we shouldn't normalize that. So it's part of that is like being like, hey, let's normalize contexts where refugees are feeling empowered, where there's spoken word for that people from the refugee community are doing. There's like a lot of books like that were just released that were made by refugees, and they're speaking their stories. So like normalizing things like that. And then on the other hand, it's also self-education is really important, reaching out to see what these organizations are that are grassroots, but then also like it's not just in the NGO level. I think a lot of refugee-led organizations are incredible, they're run by the community, but also like the people in those organizations are struggling to like make ends meet themselves. So investing in refugee-led businesses or supporting them in their entrepreneurial aspects, and helping them get to the point where they can reinvest to their own community. They don't have to ask like outsiders to invest in their community. So seeking out these local businesses within your own area that are led by refugees or immigrant populations, that's super, super important, because that works on more longer term sustainability, getting rid of this kind of like cycle of dependency that NGOs kind of have created. So along with that, if you feel like, okay, there's no NGO that I know that's like a grassroots organization in the area that I want to focus on, look into businesses, like buy a few products from them. There's so many great initiatives run by refugees, invest in them, and that's going to be a way to sustain the community in the longer term. And then focus on like educating yourself, sharing materials about like addressing like this type of thing, and like calling out organizations that are like white savior-esque. I mean, I've done a couple of posts about some organizations that just went to Kenya just for fun to take influencers, and that's problematic because it's COVID and they're not licensed professionals. So holding people accountable and then educating your peers about it's really important as well.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's something that everybody can contribute to, is holding people accountable and countering misinformation, because there is so much misinformation spread by the xenophobic lobbies and by the mainstream media and so on. I've actually had an anonymous question about supporting businesses, refugee-led businesses. I've had someone ask for people who are living in relatively rural or remote areas where they may not actually have a refugee-led business nearby, and especially given that COVID has obviously forced the temporary closure of a lot of businesses, is there anywhere that they can find kind of online stores owned by refugees that they could support, or can you recommend any, or can you recommend a resource where they can kind of locate ones that aren't too far away from them, or anything like that? Would any of you know anything about that?
In Brazil, there is a project that is called Deslocamento Criativo. It's like a collective where they put together many refugees that they do different types of business. So artisans, musicians, all this type of different refugees doing different things. And in this page in Brazil, you can find information on how to enter in contact with those refugees. So for example, some artisans, they can deliver their products all around Brazil. So it doesn't matter if you are in São Paulo or in the middle of Brazil, you can have access to these products. Some of those refugees that are, for example, musicians, they are doing like lives online, or they have their own channels on YouTube. So you can also support them, watching their videos, liking, subscribing, doing everything that social media offers to support people. So in Brazil, you have this possibility, for example.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Ghania, would you like to add to that?
Yeah. So the amazing thing about the internet, it connects people from all around the world, and there's amazing startups and organizations. I forgot the name, but there's this micro lending organization, and it's a nonprofit organization, but they have little like GoFundMe. Huh?
Kiva.
Yes, exactly. So they have a lot of like GoFundMe campaigns for like people can request anything from like a phone to like managing a business, so finding those websites, there's some that are not even microfunding, that they're just platforms where people who may or may not be refugees, you have to do a little bit more research within what's available, are asking for funds to support their business ideas and stuff like that. So looking into those specific areas and be like, hey, like if this person is asking for like $1,000 to like pay for this like gap in like their business like expenses, etc., like let me just donate a couple of dollars or whatever to that as well. So if you're living in a very rural area, those are really useful too. And then I think we're also going to start a program in the future that's working on entrepreneurship, so you guys can definitely connect with us as well to learn more. Yeah.
Oh, that's brilliant. Well, do be sure to let us know when you've got that set up, and we'll do what we can to spread the word, because yeah, that's really important. Moshood, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, we're kind of spoiled in the state, right? There's a lot of organizations, of course, doing those jobs, but that's where they make their living too. So it's not really so much to say it's just to help the refugee, then also they are making a living out of it too, but at least they're there doing the work. So, there's a lot of them here. I don't know, I can't speak to outside, because of my research, I've not been able to travel outside for a minute, but I know there's a lot of them doing the work across the world. But the ones that I know here are doing it as, it's a business more so to say than, just to help the refugees directly, But I would rather have them than not have them at all, if you know what I mean. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's the last question we've got. Is there anyone who has any last words they'd like to offer, or shall I move over to news about our next webinar? No. Okay, that's fine. Well, first of all, I'd just like, oh, sorry, Moshood.
No, I was just going to ask Ghania, where are you based? Are you in the US or you're outside in Greece?
I'm based in Chicago, but we have an on-site team in Greece.
You're in Chicago?
Yes.
I don't see you in the community. Please, you should come out. We need you.
Are you in Chicago as well?
Huh?
Are you in Chicago as well?
All my work is in Chicago.
Really? We should definitely
connect. I'm leading the World Refugee Day in Chicago here. I just stepped down as the coach here.
Oh.
I'm leading I have a lot of work that I'm doing. So please come on, come out.
Oh, we should definitely connect. I just recently moved back because I was in New York for university, so because of COVID, back here. But yeah, I would love to connect and get more involved.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of things going on here now that you'll be surprised, because I'm very critical. People have been sort of shying away from dealing with me, but it seems like we're at a critical stage, and everybody is coming around to embrace that critical frame that we can't do this work with just open hand. You can hate me all you want, but the idea is it's not about me. It's about this vulnerable population. So please, come on, let's make something happen.
Okay, let's connect over email and meet sometime.
Sure. Thank you.
Well, there you go. That is the work in action, isn't it? Is connecting people and projects and everybody supporting each other as best we can. Well, all that remains to be said then is a huge thank you to our amazing panelists. I've really enjoyed hearing your perspectives, and it's been a really great discussion. So thank you so much. And I'm just going to paste into the chat box the link for the next webinar, which will be on Sunday, the 20th of March. And that's also going to be looking about migration and the pandemic, specifically from a healthcare worker's perspective, and doing a kind of deeper dive into the healthcare issues that have arisen with regard to just trying to look after people during the pandemic and trying to treat people's health during the pandemic. So please do register for that if you're interested. And yes, I hope to see you there. Thank you again to Patricia, Moshood, and Ghania.
Thank you, Daniel.